G'day, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the third season of the History in the Bible podcast. In this final season, I explore how the Jews and the Christians constructed new religions when they were sent spinning into the void after the destruction of the temple. All of the history about all of the books beyond the Bible. Episode 3.19, Knowing Me, Knowing You, Part 1, The Children of Seth. In the last episode of History in the Bible, I discussed how the Romans perceived and vilified Christians of the 2nd century, and how Christians responded to those perceptions and calumnies. It's time we talked about Gnosticism, that baroque and confusing labyrinth of invention that threatened Orthodox Christianity for 3 centuries. Until Gnostic books were exhumed in Egypt, at Akhmim in the late 19th century, and at Nag Hammadi in the 1940s, all we knew about the Gnostics came from church fathers who hated them. To refresh yourself about Akhmim and Nag Hammadi, harken back to episode 3.1, The Heirs of Abraham. The Gnostics exploded into public consciousness 40 years ago, with the publication of the book The Gnostic Gospels. This was a popular work written by Elaine Pagels, then a young professor. She is still going strong today. Although nothing in the volume came as a surprise to scholars in the field, the book's comfortable style and illumination of an exotic subject excited a Christian public unaware of the many colours and fabrics that formed the rich tapestry of early Christianity. The book won several awards and became a bestseller. Some conventional biblical scholars were peeved that Pagels had made public what had been recondite arguments between professors, debated in obscure journals and in ivy-covered halls. The traditionalists adhered to the ancient view of the Fathers that Christianity was a monolith of orthodoxy that began with the teachings of Jesus and was unerringly propagated by the disciples. This body of sacred truth was protected from misguided and malignant heretics by the guardians of the imperial church. The traditionalists mocked Pagels for writing historical fiction. They disparaged her academic pedigree. They scoffed at the notion that the books extracted from the sandy earth had anything to do with the Gnostics described by the Church Fathers, let alone Christianity. The Fathers' descriptions of their Gnostic opponents were accurate, they said. If the discoveries at Akhmim and Nag Hammadi gave the lie to that, then these finds could not possibly be Gnostic works. The archaeologists had got it all wrong. Silly archaeologists. Catholic academics upbraided Pagels for daring to challenge the opinions of the ancient Catholic Church Fathers. Protestant professors denounced Pagels outright as anti-Christian. The traditionalists were fighting a futile rearguard action against a rising academic awakening. The overwhelming consensus today is that early Christianity was not a unified faith, fending off diabolical heretics, and that the Church Fathers were not warriors defending the one true faith. In the 2nd century, there was no one true faith. 2nd century Christianity was a loose network of communities with many different and contradictory beliefs. These congregations engaged in struggles for acceptance and survival. One community eventually won out in the early 4th century after Christianity was legalized. This community became the Imperial Church Incorporate. It constructed a more nimble, adaptive, and superior organisation to its adversaries. After the Roman state threw its weight behind the Church Incorporate, the establishment church easily suppressed its opponents, damned their writings, and condemned them as demonic heretics. The corpus of Gnostic books we now have only takes us so far. For one thing, These manuscripts portray an extraordinary range of perspective and belief. They must be the writings of different communities. Even more problematic, these documents do not lay out what the Gnostics practiced. They presuppose such matters as a milieu. With a few exceptions, these books were written by Gnostics for Gnostics. As a result, scholars dispute even the most basic issues. Does it even make sense to use the term Gnosticism to describe all the groups that produced the Akhmim and Nag Hammadi documents? Most would say yes. These professors argue that we can discern some basic commonalities. First, the Gnostic movements flourished after the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 130s. Whether they had deeper roots in history is a matter for polite professorial pondering. Second, the various groups were profoundly influenced by the Platonism of their time. They agreed with the Platonists that the divine realm was a hierarchy, or pleroma, beings emanating from the perfect one. The unknowable one was not so much a deity as pure thought itself, thinking. At each stage further removed from the ineffable one, the divine beings became coarser and more like us. Our world was created by one of these coarse beings, an ignorant and inferior deity the Gnostics called the demiurge. Demiurge is a common Greek word meaning artisan or craftsman. Third, the Gnostics held that the god craftsman had unintentionally trapped us in his gross material world. But unknown to him, the indescribable divine one had hidden in each of our crude physical bodies a little of the one's essence, a divine spark. Fourth, and finally, a divine revealer brought us hitherto secret knowledge of the truth that could release our divine essences from our material prison. The key was grasping the revealer's cryptic teachings. Some Gnostic documents name Jesus as the revealer. Many scholars suspect that some of these books are Christian reworkings of Jewish works that originally cited Jewish heroes. One point in favour of this theory is that the Gnostic documents that refer to Jesus never mention the central dogma of Christianity, that Jesus ensured our salvation by dying for our sins. All these commonalities have been recently contested by revisionist scholars. They point out that the only person who ever calls himself a Gnostic is the church father, theologian and philosopher Clement of Alexandria, who lived in the late 2nd century when the Gnostics were making a real impact. While Clement did hold some views later criticised, if not condemned, his writings show no evidence of the beliefs we normally associate with Gnosticism. The revisionists say that the very word Gnostic has been abused. The traditional view of the Gnostics followed church fathers such as Irenaeus and identified numerous discrete communities of heretics, each opposed to the other and to the one true church. But really, these communities were very porous. You can point to any early church fathers, A, B and C, and show that A and B had more in common with the Gnostics than either had with C. The revisionists argue that all the early groups in Christianity were not only porous, but engaged in dynamic struggles to define themselves as distinct from each other. They did so by creating common histories and traditions, writing sacred texts, fashioning social rituals such as baptism and shared meals, and labelling their enemies as others. The revisionists also say that it is almost impossible to create a definition of so polymorphic a movement as Gnosticism. Mainstream academics hold that Gnosticism was a protest movement of alienated dropouts who rejected the material world and society. Yet the Orthodox Christians lambasted Gnostics for rejecting martyrdom, eating meat dedicated to idols, and participating in pagan social rituals. If anything, the Orthodox were much more antisocial than the Gnostics. The usual characterization of Gnosticism also holds that it hated the material prison of our bodies. Yet some Gnostic books value human bodies as possessing the divine spark. For every Gnostic cliché that mainstream scholars offer, you can find a counterexample in the Gnostic literature. For what little it is worth, my own opinion is that the revisionists are perversely persnickety. Yes, they make some excellent points, but, well, the issues may be resolved in a decade or four, well after my time. A wary truce has been drawn between the professorial camps by dividing the Gnostics into the Sethians and the Valentinians. The Sethians are the oldest group of Gnostics. Sethians. That's our name for them. We have no idea how they referred to themselves, or if they regarded themselves as a single community. They flourished after the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 130s. Some scholars argue that their roots are much older, by a good century or more. The Sethians thought of themselves as the spiritual successors to Seth, the third son of Adam and Eve, after Abel and Cain. You don't hear much about Seth, do you? Seth is the ancestor of all the famous antediluvian patriarchs, including Methuselah, Enoch, and Noah. Thanks to his fratricidal brother Cain, Abel had no children. The ancient Hebrews were unsure if Cain's descendants survived the flood. The Sethians were in no doubt that they did. All the world could be divided in two: the enlightened children of Seth, for whom salvation was possible, and the boorish children of Cain, for whom it was not. The Roman Jewish historian Josephus held Seth in high regard. Quote, Antiquities of the Jews, 1, 2, 3. Yes, that's the actual reference, 1, 2, 3. Now this Seth, when he was brought up, and came to those years in which he could discern what was good, became a virtuous man. And as he was himself of an excellent character, so did he leave children behind who imitated his virtues. All these proved to be of good dispositions. They also inhabited the same country without dissensions, and in a happy condition, without any misfortunes falling upon them till they died. They also were the inventors of that peculiar sort of wisdom which is concerned with the heavenly bodies and their order. End quote. According to the Sethians, Adam revealed to Seth the truth about the universe. This was a truth that Cain and Abel were unable to comprehend. Adam told Seth that they were created by the god craftsman, arrogant, ignorant, and inferior god, who was too stupid to understand his own mediocrity. I'm sure you can think of any number of politicians like that. This inferior godling, said Adam, was less powerful than his creations. Seth comes to understand that his loyalties are to a higher god, not the oblivious god craftsman. Let's get a little taste of the Sethians from the Apocryphon of John, also known as the Secret Book of John. The church father Irenaeus mentioned the book in passing. A copy was finally uncovered at Nag Hammadi in the 1940s. Here is the opening section of the secret book. It begins with a description of the indescribable one. Yes, okay, the irony. And the one's first offspring. Long quote. The one is a sovereign with nothing above it. It is he who exists as God and Father of everything, the invisible one who is above everything, who exists as incorruption, which is in the pure light into which no eye can look. And his thought performed a deed, and she came forth, namely she who had appeared before him in the shine of his light. This is the first power, which is before all of them, and which came forth from his mind. She is the forethought of the all. The first power, the glory of Barbello, the perfect glory in the eons, the glory of the revelation. She requested from the invisible virginal spirit, that is Barbello, to give her foreknowledge, and the Spirit consented. And she requested again to grant her indestructibility, and he consented. And Barbello requested to grant her eternal life, and the invisible Spirit consented. And she requested again to grant her truth, and the invisible Spirit consented. This is the pentad of the eons of the Father, which is the first man, the image of the invisible Spirit. It is the forethought, which is Barbello, and the thought and the foreknowledge, and the indestructibility, and the eternal life and the truth. This is the androgynous pentad of the eons, which is the decad of the eons, which is the Father. End quote. No, I don't understand either. The Supreme Being is much as the Platonists believe, not so much an entity as pure thinking. Thoughts emanated out of the thinking. The Perfect One produces beings called eons, who go on to produce their own eons in male and female pairs. At each stage the eons become coarser, moving from pure abstraction into rude materiality. All these eons form the divine pleroma. Way down the chain, an eon called Sophia conceives a child without her male consort. This child, called there's the Yaldabaoth or Sackler, is born outside the pleroma. He thinks he is the only divine being. This is the craftsman god the Jews knew. Yaldabaoth was a poor craftsman. He fashioned a world of demons and misery and suffering. Fortunately, the Perfect One outwitted Yaldabaoth and bestowed upon the descendants of Seth a spark of divinity. Those with no divine spark, the descendants of Cain, were doomed. But at least the Sethians had a way out of Yaldabaoth's miserable creation. Only they could find the path. If we can come to knowledge of this divine spark, said the Sethians, we can be rescued from our bodily prisons. The goal of the Sethians was to return the divine spark that is in the descendants of Seth to its heavenly home with the One. Salvation depends on how we, the real us, our minds, can learn how to escape the body and extricate ourselves from this terrible material world. We can only do that by learning the truth about our divine origin. But how? By studying the teachings of a divine messenger, a revealer. The early church fathers were adamant that Sethian Gnosticism was a Christian heresy invented to corrupt the purity of the faith passed down by the disciples. Decades of scholarly work show that the movement has a more complex origin in Second Temple Judaism, not Christianity. Clearly, some Sethian notions derive from the Platonists. By this time in the school's intellectual development, Platonism had decided that the ultimate abstract entity, the One, was incomprehensible to us. The school spent much of its time trying to understand how our gross material world could possibly have originated from the Perfect One. So that's one obvious difference from Judaism. But what is the relationship between all the many Sethian books and Judaism? At first glance, Sethian stories seem to bear no more resemblance to Jewish works than the Harry Potter books do. Yet the Sethian documents are abrim with references to the Tanakh, the Old Testament. A closer look shows that the Sethian imagery and themes are very similar to the Baroque imaginings of the apocalyptic books written during the preceding 5 centuries. Both claim to depict divine realities and a layered cosmos. To revisit my shows on the rich apocalyptic books, pour yourself a pint of Prosecco and set your aircon to comfy. Then drift away to my episode 2.9, The Apocalypse to End Them All, First Enoch. Where the Sethians are unique is in their concept of the material world. The Sethian books hold that evil is written into the very fabric of a corrupt world. That is nothing like the Old Testament understanding that bad things happen when people fail to follow God's law. Nor does it follow the late Second Temple Jewish ideas that evil was brought to the world by fallen angels such as Satan. Nor does it resemble the Christian view that evil arises from human sin. One theory, and it's not a bad one, is that Sethianism was the end stage of two intellectual crises in Second Temple Judaism. The first crisis occurred during the early Hellenistic period. After a period of delirious joy as Persian subjects, the Judeans suddenly found themselves under the yoke of the Hellenes. Then the Judeans became subject to an even greater power, the Romans. God had failed to return his people to the status and position they deserved. In response, the Jews produced a whole literature of hope, the apocalyptic books. They were attempts to reassure the Jews that God had not forgotten them. Real soon now, God, or Enoch, or the Messiah, or someone, would remove their secular oppressors and restore the Jews to their rightful happy place in the world and in God's standing. These hopes were bitterly dashed by the three revolts against Rome. The expectations so stirred by books like First Enoch and Jubilees had come to naught. After the Bar Kokhba revolt, few Jews could believe that the hoped-for deliverance was imminent. God would not save the Judeans from the Romans. The failure of the apocalyptic prophecies was the second intellectual crisis. Don't look for deliverance in this world, the Sethians said. Aspire for deliverance in the next. The Sethians referenced Jewish ideas, all that stuff about Adam and Seth, because their roots were in Judaism. Some have speculated that the Sethians began as a priestly faction that disavowed the corrupt temple establishment and went its own way, rather like the Essenes. Christians co-opted the Sethian works for their own purposes. The secret book of John, for example, is framed as a conversation between Jesus after his resurrection and the disciple John. But the prologue and epilogue that mention Jesus could easily have been tacked on by later Christians. The secret book casts Jesus as the divine messenger who reveals the truth about our divine origins. But the original text could easily have used Jewish figures such as Elijah or Enoch instead. Sethian Gnosticism may have reached its peak around the year 200, just when the Jewish Law Digest, the Mishnah, was codified. To refresh yourself about that document, settle back with a spoodle at your feet and enjoy episode 3.17, Quest for the Rabbis Part 2, the Mishnah. Thereafter, the rabbis forged ahead with their own distinctive ideas. They had no place for the florid fantasies of the apocalyptic books, nor the cryptic Sethian works. Mainstream Christians eventually found Sethianism increasingly strange and too divergent from their own belief systems. By the time that the Romans legalized Christianity around 310, the Sethians were a marginal group. But their beliefs would pop up again in Europe during the Middle Ages. In the next episode, I investigate the other group of Gnostics, the Valentinians. Thanks for visiting. For show notes, maps, charts, and timelines, visit my website at www.historyinthebible.com. You can even download professional posters for free.